Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the third and final session of an overview that the department is providing for IU executive directors and staff regarding the Accelerated Learning Through an Integrated System of Support project. With us today, we have the leadership team from the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, including Acting Deputy Secretary Dr. Sherry Smith, who's going to kick us off with some opening remarks and a charge to you regarding this project. Dr. Smith.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Fuller, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us for our last session. We are recording this session so that intermediate unit partners and such that are not able to make it to the meeting today are able to watch it at a later date. So as we start today, just want to again thank you for this past year. One of the things that the OESE team and I talk about all the time is how the support from our intermediate unit partners were a critical aspect of the leadership and the technical assistance that we provided to our schools, probably the most tenacious year in education, at least in our lifetimes. So again, thank you for that support, for being our arms, our legs, our communication out to the field, and know that we certainly could not have done it without you. As we move into next year, we have a new challenge that's in front of us, kind of the post, let's be hopeful that it is the post pandemic responses where we can concentrate our time and our energies on mitigating any of the learning gaps and the social and emotional concerns that we think have occurred over the last year and a half as we did our best to mitigate the pandemic. So we need your guidance and we need your support as we move into this next year, and it's critical for us to have that. One of the other things that the team and I talk about on a regular basis is that one of the things that we've seen significantly improve over this past year and a half is the relationships and the collaboration that have occurred between the intermediate units, the state, as well as our PTAM partners. And that's something we don't want to lose. There's a lot of things that happened over the course of the pandemic that as we come out of it, were good things and things that we want to continue to build on. So no, we look to you this coming year to assist us with moving things forward. In a few minutes, unfortunately, I'll have to drop from this call and spending the rest of the time with you because I'm going to go over and the governor's going to be doing his presentation speech on probably one of the biggest financial gains for public education in a long time in Pennsylvania. That's something for us to be proud about, but also provides another challenge for our schools. The pure nature of the amount of federal funding that has come to our schools over this last year presents a challenge for them on how they spend that and how they spend that in a manner that truly affects and improves and the academic and the social and emotional learning of our students. So we want coherence with our work that we do with our LEAs. They've got a lot of things that are on their back, and they're really counting on us as a collaborative unit to help them, to guide them in the work that they do. So one of the cohesion pieces that we want to talk about is the state system of support work that, as you know, we have with all of you. And we wanted to make that a little bit more cohesive and putting it under one statement of work. As we do that, though, one of the main reasons that we need to do that is because of the latest amount of ARP ESSER dollars that we received from USDE to support our LEAs across the state. You may not know, but just as a point of reference, is we received just less than $10 billion in funding for public education in Pennsylvania this past year. That's an incredible amount of money, and again, provides a real challenge to our LEAs on how to spend those dollars. So, and then aside of that is that 10% of the set aside of the ARP ESSER are for some state activities that we believed were most critical as we've gone around and listened to our stakeholders across the state and listening to them about what the biggest concerns of our students are coming into this next year. By far, bar none, our team agrees is that the thing we've heard the most is the social and emotional and mental health concerns of our staff and our students moving into this next year. And know that a great part of the state set aside dollars are then directed to social and emotional and mental health personnel and programs to be able to support our students and our staff moving forward. We also looked at reading in the through the chapter 49. We're looking at literacy and the science of literacy as something that we want all pre-service teachers, as well as our teachers, and particularly the K-4 special education and English learning teachers, to have specific training on and be able to assist our students in being more technical readers. And so as we move those state plans forward, along with the 90% of which 20% of those dollars that went out to all of our LEAs needs to be spent on learning gaps. They're going to need, again, our support and your support as IU directors in how to use those funds effectively, that are evidence-based, and to be honest with you, collecting the data and submitting it back to us for USDE. One of the biggest requirements that is coming out of particularly the last set of ESSER dollars, the ARP ESSER, is the reporting requirements on student groups, how we're mitigating all of the learning and the social and emotional learning across the state. So that's where our relationship with all of you comes in again. And that relationship will be through our state system of support work. One of the things that we're cognizant of is, as we've had separate statements of work for the state system of support these past few years, is that it's been overwhelming and many times doesn't allow you to focus and target on the particular needs of your schools in your regions. So by moving everything into one statement of work, we're hopeful that it again provides that cohesion and targeted assistance for our schools that makes sense, instead of acts of just getting something accomplished and reporting it to the state. So our state system of support will be called Accelerated Learning. And the reason why is the Accelerated Learning Toolkit, which our team is going to walk you through here in a minute, is where we're benchmarking all of our work, and we're hoping all of your guidance out to our LEAs this next year. It includes systems conditions, academics, social and emotional wellness, scaffolded supports and strategies. All the work that we talk about that schools need benchmark off of this toolkit. And many of you know that, because that toolkit would not have been developed without the support and the hard work of many of our IU and PATAM partners across the state. And no, this is not something the department owns. It's something to be proud of as a unified approach on how we provided a toolkit, resources, research, and technical assistance for our schools moving into next year. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Fuller to walk you through the presentation today. Thank you again for taking the time. And seriously, folks, we really look forward to that continued strong relationship this next year as we help our schools move into a new era. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. We'll look forward to seeing you in a positive way on the news later on today. So that's good stuff. Well, again, thank you all for joining us. My name is Dr. Jeffrey Fuller. I'm the Director for the Bureau of School Support here at the department. And our task today is to provide for you an overview of the Accelerated Learning Project and the resources that are available to you as you start to work with LEAs in rolling out in the project and planning for school for the next year. We're going to provide a more in-depth look at each of the four main components that Dr. Smith mentioned a minute ago from the experts in the field, then quickly talk about the Act 45 requirements that are available, or the Act 45 project that is available, and what the requirements are for that. And then we'll provide some time at the end for questions, because we do want this to be a more conversational if it's possible. We will pause at various times throughout the morning to see if you have questions on each of the sections that we're working through. You can either use the raise hand button on your screen or the chat box to add questions. So if you remember, if you can remember a year and a half or so ago at the start of the pandemic, The department rolled out the roadmap for educational leaders. And the roadmap was designed to provide research, tools, resources, and professional learning for educational leaders as we all face the challenges of COVID. We went through last spring and summer, and the pandemic continued. And so in the spring of 2021, we found that we were all still deep in the throes of dealing with COVID and those related issues. So PDE rolled out a new segment of the roadmap called the Accelerated Learning Through an Integrated System of Support. The idea behind accelerated learning was to create a simple systems and process-driven framework that is flexible, that honors the lessons that we learned over the last year and a quarter, that provides models, approaches, and templates that can assist LEAs, and includes a collection of resources and research that have all been vetted and used successfully in Pennsylvania schools, and most importantly, is focused through an equitable and trauma-informed lens. Accelerated learning draws from the work of the CCSSO and their work on restart and recovery. It draws from the New Teacher Project and the ERS and MTSS frameworks. And it's been supported by many of you. As I look through the participants this morning, I see many names that were vital in helping us to develop sessions and provide sessions to the field. Between PAIUNet and Patan, we were able to roll out a series of live and asynchronous webinars that began back in early April with a kickoff from then Deputy Secretary Matt Stem, and continued through early June with the main body of sessions. We will have a final round of collaborative check-ins and sessions in late July and early August as well. Now, we've provided a number of really strong resources for you. And to talk through that, I'm going to share my screen. I think I'm going to share my screen. There we go. All of the resources can be found on the Accelerated Learning website. And we've made it very easy to get to that website. Oops. It's education.pa.gov/accelerated learning. So as simple as it can be, and that will take you to the Accelerated Learning landing page. The landing page provides a very brief overview of the project, and I would encourage you, since we're all sitting at computers, to pull up the website and follow along, because this really is going to be the main tool that we're using as we are talking about accelerated learning. And as you scroll down, you can see those four main areas of focus that Dr. Smith mentioned: high quality academics, supportive learning environments, healthy systems conditions, and scaffolded support. So the first two, high quality academics and supportive learning environments, are really look at the interaction that we have with our communities and with our students and with our staff. And then the last two, systems conditions and scaffolded supports, are the sort of logistics behind all that. So we're going to work our way through each of those sections. There are multiple ways to get to the accelerated learning support information that's available on the website. One of the easiest ways is through this resource box on the right-hand side. The Accelerated Learning Toolkit, which we'll come back to in a minute, really is the roadmap through the project. To gain access to all of the sessions and all of the slide decks, you can either click on the headings here, which are hyperlinks that will take you to an overview of each of the professional learning sessions that was provided, a link to the recorded webinar from the original presentation, and a link to the slide deck that supports each of those presentations. You can also access that same information through this Accelerated Learning Webinar Series Resources link, which takes you to another landing page. And from there, you can access each of the 4 main areas and that same information. Then there's a number of links regarding the Act 45 course that we'll come back to later in the morning, the planning template, and then another set of links to access the series courses. Let's take a little closer look at the toolkit, because as I said, the toolkit really is the map for the program. It's the guide through which all of the information is explained and all of the resources are gained. The Accelerated Learning Toolkit is first provides an overview of the Accelerated Learning Project with links to some of the basic supporting documentation. As we said, we wanted it to be a programmatic, a systemic process for improvement. And so it is set up and described in that way. And here again, you can see the 4 main components. And each of the components is set up using this basic framework. First, a description of why that component is worth using, what makes it useful, what is the strategic advantage for implementing those programs in an LEA in a school. What are the key actions that schools and LEAs need to take? When we were first beginning to design accelerated learning, we talked to educational leaders from different parts of the state. And what they said was they really wanted a checklist, essentially. So as they're making decisions and planning for their schools, they can read down through that checklist and see, okay, here it says to do this. Do I have that? Check it off, move on. Do I have that? No. Here's a link where I can go to get additional resources. Each of the groups will provide more detail on that so you have an understanding of how that works. We provide a large number of tools that have been thoroughly vetted and most of which have been implemented successfully in Pennsylvania schools. So we know that they work. And then a number of professional learning modules. There are 27 sessions that are currently included in the website, in the YouTube channel, that provide direct information on how the Accelerated Learning Project and the resources that are included there work. That's a very brief overview of the toolkit and some of the resources that are available, how it's set up. To begin the conversation in more depth, we know that one of the biggest areas of focus as we return students and staff to our schools has to be on their social and emotional wellness for both the students and for our staff. To talk more about the components of the healthy learning environments, I'd like to introduce Scott Curran, who is the director of the Office of Safe Schools. Scott.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it and great opening. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to provide the 1 to 2 minute quick elevator speech just to kind of set the groundwork. And then Dr. Malakovic, who kind of leads this work for us, is really going to do a deeper dive and walk you through all the different components that are in accelerated learning for social and emotional wellness. So as we know, most of the time, the approach to mental health in schools can be a bit disjointed, not very systematic. So our approach to the social and emotional section was really crafted in a way to provide a structured mindset and approach. This is usually something that you see more with academics, where there's benchmark testing, formative assessments, and so on. But this also needs to be the same approach for the learning environment and social and emotional wellness work. Just assuming every student is or has been traumatized by the pandemic and providing that one-size-fits-all support structure certainly wouldn't be equitable. Therefore, we took a collaborative approach And we included many of the IU staff, as was discussed earlier, and we engaged them in the social and emotional work. The staff involved everybody, including our POCs for bullying prevention and our SCRCs, which are our school climate resource coordinators in the IUs. Our approach to address the social and emotional needs of students and staff within the learning environment certainly was all encompassing. One of the big highlight things that we talked about is that we can't have this stand alone in a silo. This has to be integrated throughout all the other modules, academic, scaffolded supports, and systems conditions. So addressing the needs of students returning to the classroom really needs to be an integrated cycle of improvement that encourages cross-collaboration between social and emotional wellness, academics, those scaffolded supports, and then systems conditions. Using the tools within the social and emotional section of the roadmap, it will help LEAs generate a more holistic mindset of support. If you assist schools in focusing on kids first and those human needs that create and build resiliency and strengthen relationships, the needed gains in all areas will certainly be better. Social and emotional and behavioral supports have always been critical attributes of healthy school environments. But on the heels of COVID, stakeholders have experienced varying levels of social isolation, stress, anxiety, and even trauma. This section will help school systems determine how equitable, trauma-informed learning environments can be incorporated into the policies, procedures, and practices moving into the 2021-2022 school year. You will see the use of data and universal practices integrated into the framework to ensure equity, inclusion through a multi-level approach. We really want the social and emotional wellness to, we really want the approach to social and emotional wellness to be deliberate and grounded in good data decisions. The details that Dr. Dana Milakovic are going to discuss within the learning environment is a purposeful framework dedicated to working within each LEA's own system to identify the needs, move to action, collaborate, and then mobilize for support. Dr. Milakovic will now walk us through the social and emotional section and highlight the framework and how you guys can all support LEAs within your regions. Dana, take it away.
Thank you, Scott. As Scott mentioned, we really do want to focus on a purposeful, planned way of implementing social emotional learning and mental wellness supports so that we are creating a positive, supportive learning environment. We very intentionally chose learning environment. We want everyone who works with students in the school systems to understand that in order to make academic gains, we also have to structure the learning environment to be able to make those gains. If we do not address the mental wellness of our staff and our students, we aren't able to free up cognitive capacity for our teachers and our educators to teach and to support relationships, or our administrators to support those relationships and plan and run effective school systems. And our students aren't able to learn. They're not able to have the emotional or the cognitive capacity to gain academics, which we need them to continue to grow on in order to become career-ready adults. So what we did was we laid out how we can create positive learning environments using that cycle of continuous improvement. We really want to use this project and our IU partners who have been so instrumental in creating this in how do we have educational entities look at social emotional learning, at mental wellness, the same way you would look at academics. And as Scott mentioned, this doesn't involve saying, okay, everyone who comes back has been traumatized. We need to do one-on-one social emotional instruction for each student. We need to have mental health providers meet with each student. We know that that's not feasibility. We can't do that. It's not fair for all of our students. As Scott mentioned, we really want to look at an equitable trauma-informed approach. And the order to do that, we want to focus on a universal level first. So what do we put in place first and then build upon that? And that's really what this section is about. It's about the understanding that we know not every school system is involved in MTSS, but everyone does provide some tiered level of support. So when you look at the positive supportive learning environments, again, as Jeff mentioned, it will have the exact same sections as all of the next ones will, the worth it and the key actions, and then resources. So really thinking about creating that safe, positive learning environment, looking at how are we going to be trauma informed. And this doesn't mean that you're necessarily engaged in what educational systems would call trauma informed. This means that you're looking at everything through a relationship focus. We understand that you can't go into, okay, I wasn't doing mental health work before, I wasn't involved in social emotional learning, I wasn't involved in trauma informed, and now after the pandemic, I'm going full board and everything is going to be exactly how I want it to be. This is a journey. This is really a marathon, and we want to help schools use data to make that marathon effective and purposeful for our students and our staff. So as Jeff mentioned, we do have the checklist. So the key actions really do tie back to the original roadmap and then expand on them. So developing that staff and student wellness communication plan, looking at social emotional supports for staff. We intentionally put staff first. And when you look at the staff component, you're going to see a tiered approach for that as well. Helping schools think through what supports are we providing for our staff. And as Megan's going to talk about later, this ties into retention, it ties into recruitment for staff, it ties into the infrastructure in the school system. But we know that schools are going to need help with that. So the way that we also did that was then looking at, okay, we took our staff, now we address staff capacity, and then we looked at staff compassion resilience so that we think about how do we help the burnout levels for staff? How do we help staff want to come into the building and help with absenteeism of staff? And then move into the social and emotional supports for students. So looking at social emotional wellness, looking at mental health needs, looking at referral systems, really looking at that tiered approach and how you implement that in a school setting. And then lastly, but certainly not least, how do we align this with our supplemental student supports? So looking at what key programs are present in our schools. How do we align with that program? We know that our students exist outside of our school system, and obviously we want to partner with them. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in our teaming section. But this really looks at the programs that are connected. What are childcare programs that are connected? What are federally funded programs that are connected? Really thinking about programs such as your homeless education, your migrant workers, parenting, teen parenting prevention. So thinking about those partners and how we can really intentionally tie what they're doing into our plan. So we do have tools through all of these, and the way that we broke it down was in data and planning, and then needs assessment, resource mapping, teaming, and as Scott mentioned, ending with the staff and student wellness, really mobilizing everything that you've learned. So these go more in depth when you click on the webinars, and I'm just going to briefly overview them here for the sake of time. But as they mentioned, this toolkit really is a one-stop shop. So you click on the link, it will take you to exactly the resource. You don't have to look it up. You can always delve deeper, but the resources are there, and the webinars also have resources that are more in-depth for each individual area. So data and planning. If I go into a school and I ask them, what are you doing for your data and planning to really look at your continuous cycle of improvement? They would say for academics, oh, look, I have DIBELS, I have running records, I have, and they would list, and they would just keep going on. And often when we say, what are you doing to address mental wellness? How are you addressing the mental wellness of your staff? How are you addressing mental wellness of your students? How do you measure social emotional learning? Some schools have screeners, but often what we hear is nothing. We're not sure. We don't know how to do that. But we want to really help schools think about what is already in place and what can they add. So thinking about things such as absenteeism as more than just a way to track how many days you've missed and submit that to the state, but thinking of it as this is a red flag for something else going on. Looking at your office referrals, minors and majors, looking at your climate data, looking at all of these pieces of information, many of which you already have, but looking at them in a different way. And this section walks through how you can do that. Then you can also go into wider lenses, such as your PAYS data. What is this telling us about what we need to put in place in our tier 1 so that we're providing prevention programming? And again, we know that this is new, so this section and webinar really does walk you through that step by step and provide systematic resources. Again, as we go through each of these and you're working with LEAs, we want to encourage you to start small and build up. It's easier to start small in your systematic planning and go back to when Jeff mentioned on the front page, the planning template and creating SMARTY goals on how do you do that in a systematic way. We're not asking you to just jump straight into having screening or jump straight into curriculum buying. We're really looking at how do we do this in a slow, systematic way. The needs assessment and resource mapping really looks at how do you assess the needs of your district, of your individual school buildings, as well as what is already there. What resources do you have? What resources are you contracting for? What are you, how are you using your staff and their capacity? So this really walks through that system of what do I have? What do I need? How do I get there? With an understanding that there is just no feasible way for school districts to do everything by themselves. And we really want to look at, from a technical assistance standpoint, how do we help them develop connections to their intermediate unit partners, to their patent partners, to the department and their community. So really helping them think outside the box and really helping them think about developing capacity within as well as partnering with other systems. And then we take that a step forward with teaming. Really thinking through teaming. We understand that schools have a ton of teams and we're not asking for another one to be developed. We're asking in this module for us to really think about how do we use our teams, really taking a systematic look at what teams are present in your district, in your buildings, what are their purposes, what are the roles of individuals on those teams, and is there a way that we can combine teams that may be duplicating services and supports? How do we really partner in order to meet our goals and related to social emotional learning and positive supportive learning environments? This has to involve looking through a trauma-informed lens and making sure that we are inviting family members and the community into our teams in order to support this work. They are a vital part of the work that we want to do, and we have to make sure that we're engaging them and empowering them to be decision makers in our school processes. And then lastly, but certainly not least, looking at the mobilization of staff and student wellness. This really involves thinking about what are steps that we can take to make sure that we're addressing the mental wellness of our staff and our students so our students can learn and our staff can educate. This also invites you to really take a look at administrators. How are we addressing administrator burnout? How are we looking at the wellness of our administrators? And then I would expand that as you're doing this work with districts to think about from an IU perspective, how are you taking care of yourselves? How are you ensuring that staff wellness is present? Because we continue to focus on students, but we're missing the pieces in between. And if we can't develop the wellness components in the individuals who provide the technical assistance, who provide the support from an intermediate level, from IU executive directors all the way down to TAC consultants, to educators in the classroom, to our district educators and administrators, we really need to look at that wide spectrum so we can free up their mental resources to be able to support relationship building for our students. I am going to stop sharing and ask if there are any questions before I turn this back over to Jeff. Okay, not seeing any. There will be chances for questions at the end. So if you think of any, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we will address them at the end.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Scott. So obviously we understand the deep need for focusing on the social and emotional wellness of our students and staff. We also have to, because we are schools, have to look at the academic piece and make sure that we are providing that strong, high quality academic program. So to talk more about that, I'll introduce Brian Campbell and Brian Gasper. Gentlemen.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So I'm Brian Gasper, and joining me with is Brian Campbell, and we've had the distinct pleasure to work with a really fantastic group of assessment and instruction professionals from our IUs, as well as our department professionals, to create and focus on our high quality academics modules. And our modules include the assessment, analyzing and interpretation of data, instruction and reflection, monitoring and sharing of that data. And our modules are split into 4, but they're combining, and they're based off of the assessment wheel that has been created years ago and has been utilized in our PA literacy plan, and has really been the focus of really just creating a strong assessment plan. So the first area of our first module is assessment, and it really goes into focusing in on 3 guiding questions. And basically, how is your assessment plan? Does it reflect your district's values for teaching and learning? Are the assessments high quality, rigorous, and implemented with fidelity? And also, do they maximize equity, accessibility, and inclusiveness for our students? And these are snapshots straight from the toolkit. Basically, how are we going to support educators in making deliberate assessment choices within that comprehensive system to allow students to effectively engage in their grade level work? And the worth it is really, creating that highly developed assessment system, including a balanced approach, focusing in on formal and informal assessments, those classroom-based evidence showing growth of those students, and really including those assessment tools that are congruent with the district goals, the curriculum, the teaching, and the learning. And the key actions, all of the modules, of course, include some of those key actions, identifying the purpose of each assessment, aligning those assessments with the values and goals, examining the assessment load. How many assessments are you utilizing? Do you have duplicative data? So, really focusing in on what your assessments are really assessing and how you're going to use that data, and allowing for flexible scheduling for your assessments, but then also for the instruction, as which is one of our future modules here. And of course, there are several tools. Each tool is hyperlinked. Our SAS Assessment Center, which has really been upgraded over the past year, which is a fantastic opportunity. The PA Literacy Plan, our CDTs, all of these things are free, and they're all fantastic options for our educators. Of course, there's so many of the resources are within our SAS portal, which is really our state's comprehensive resource center for educators. And each of the modules and then each of the guiding questions does have a scale for educators, LEAs, to really assess their plan and assess where they are, whether they're emerging, operational, or they have an exemplar, or there's no evidence yet. So it really is going to allow them the opportunity to assess their program, and then in turn work with their intermediate unit folks to focus in on the professional development and to help with that deficit. I'll turn this over to Brian Campbell, as this is a fantastic opportunity for districts this year where we're permitting and have the ability to utilize local assessment data. Brian?
Thank you, Brian. And thanks everyone for joining us today. And I want to talk quickly about the local assessment project that's currently happening at PDE. And while this project is sort of a separate project, it's running very parallel and has become an integrated part of the roadmap, in that this is an opportunity for schools to get some data that they might otherwise be missing, especially some gap data that they can use with these tools, not just the tools in the academic section of the roadmap, but really all the tools that require some data collection and have that those additional data points. The advantage here with this system is that schools will receive the reports and the data tools in a format that's consistent with the analytics they're used to seeing on the state assessments, on the Keystone and PSSAs and PASA assessments. So you may already have some data tools and some data systems built into your student information system, or you might have those through a vendor. But in this case, you're looking at comparability. These reports are going to be normed to Pennsylvania test scores, and they are going to be, again, in the same format as some of the PVAS reports and some of the metric reports that folks are used to looking at. As we look at things like unfinished teaching and learning that may have resulted in learning gaps and a lot of the things that folks are going to want to measure through last year in the mitigation efforts, we were really looking at 2 potential years of gap data. In 1920, the tests were waived by USDE for all 50 states, so Pennsylvania didn't issue state assessments. And while we're issuing those state assessments in 2021, we have extended the window through September, which means a lot of those results are not going to come back, really into probably the next year, calendar year. And we know that with the 95% participation wave, even with our efforts to stretch the testing window, there are going to be students with certain health conditions and certain concerns between the student or the guardian that just aren't going to get in and take these assessments in this calendar year. So it's possible that there are 2 years of missing data for a lot of these children. This data is important, not just in informing the instruction that as Brian's shown you in the wheel, we call it, and that's a huge step, but also in a lot of the decision-making that school leaders are going to look into: resource allocation, program design. The ESSA grant requires a lot of data for reporting. Any kind of we're going to talk about staffing in this presentation, and knowing where kids are and how many sections and how much remediation and things like that will affect staffing. It's going to affect resource allocation in the purchase of materials and things like that. So how this program works is that school may submit local assessment data through PIMS. If a school is using the CDT as their local benchmarking or diagnostic, that school would actually not have to submit in the PIMS, because we can pull directly from the vendor. CDTs are obviously PD, intellectual property, so they can be pulled directly. Folks will submit these scores through PIMS. There's a template created. We try to make it as easy as possible. We have worked with some of the SIS vendors and some of the data warehousing groups, and worked on custom reports and things like that are available to help schools make this data pool. The collection remains open through July 16th, so there's about 3 more weeks. The important thing to remember for schools, this data is going straight to our vendors, and the reports go directly to these schools through the online systems, which they usually receive reports. PD is not collecting this data for accountability in any way. Act 136 waived a lot of the accountability anyway, but honestly, this is not data that will be turned directly over to the department. PDE will use aggregate statewide data to plan some of the professional development and some of the materials and resources that are going to go along with this tab in the accelerated system. But none of this data is used for accountability or public reporting. The pool is voluntary, but we really do encourage LEAs to grab this extra resource or fill in some of that data. The learning gap issue is going to be a hot topic, and this is an opportunity to gather some additional data points, both in growth and in performance, when schools want to make analysis around that. So I know a lot of you on the call, I'm going to echo Brian in that, looking through your names, I know a lot of you have been very active in this project anyway. PAI UCC has been instrumental in cheerleading this project and in assisting folks. Same way with our IU DQN staff have been really helpful in the PIMS polls and things. So we just kind of ask you to, be familiar with the project, continue to cheerlead and continue to champion the project. And then when these data points come in and we're looking at this step of the roadmap, when you're working with your LEAs, remember this is one data source you have as you work your way through this analysis and interpretation cycle.
Good. Okay, thank you, Brian. So moving on, the next step, the next focus on our wheel is the analyzation and interpretation of data. And the three main guiding questions are how you're going to begin to engage schools, school leaders, and school staff in the analysis and interpretation of data. How are you implementing the data analysis protocols effectively to inform your instruction? And how are you ensuring educators have the opportunity to collaborate and make curricular decisions on the data analysis? So, of course, the worth it, making sure that key team members are included within that area, making sure that we continually assess the usefulness of the assessment tools, and realizing that there's a collective understanding of the needs of the individual students that we're focusing in and removing some of those barriers for all of our students. Of course, the key actions, the checklist, making sure that we're defining the scope of the analysis, we're using multiple data sources and points to make those decisions, ensuring the identification of students' individual strengths and weaknesses, and empowering those professionals, the professional learning communities, to be able to make those curricular decisions as they're providing the instruction. Some of our tools, of course, are eMetric, the data that's provided in eMetric, the local assessment data that is now available, our DRC Insight availability. Our next item, of course, is instruction, and this is really where the rubber meets the road and where we can really make some of the largest differences within that unfinished learning. So focusing in on those three guiding questions, what is the allotted time for instruction? How are you using a variety of instructional methods? And how are you ensuring the alignment to the performance expectations and curricular emphasis across all grade levels? And what instructional changes need to be made for this upcoming year, the 2021-2022 school year, and then beyond? These are systematic changes that really need to take place, because this is not just a year, this is going to be a several year process. Of course, the worth it is really just identifying the unfinished learning and allowing educators to plan for the following year. What instructional best practices are expected and evident in classrooms, and making sure that administrators are focusing in and making sure that they're provided with fidelity, and making sure that all students have access to an equitable educational experience. Of course, several key actions within instruction: just performing curriculum audit, which is absolutely necessary, reviewing the master schedule, how can courses be given, and do we need to adjust their time, creating those common assessments, implementing accountability measures, making sure that our administrators ensure fidelity, and considering instructional practices for in-person, hybrid, and remote learning opportunities. And of course, our tools, our SAS portal, the Professional Development Center, the roadmap, some of the information that has been provided in roadmaps 1 and 2, and just some other fantastic opportunities here. Our current teacher effectiveness and our upcoming teacher effectiveness plans. And finally, our reflection, monitor, and sharing opportunities. The three main guiding questions on that: what formal and informal opportunities exist to promote that reflection and collaboration? Have you created a system process using for assessment and monitoring those student needs? And then really one of the most important, and we focused in on this on the social emotional learning, but really how are we communicating and engaging our families and caregivers? How do we create a data culture that focuses on the effective use of data to inform our instruction and supporting teacher collaboration, and then engaging parents and caregivers? If data is not used, then time devoted to that assessment is going to be wasted. And the key actions, really just making sure that we develop a system and a process to use that data, creating informal and formal and informal opportunities to promote teacher collaboration, and promoting practices, again, to communicate the progress regularly to our families and our caregivers. And there are several tools. There's really an opportunity. There's a great video within the module that just really rolls through a planning process and a communication process, which is really a great opportunity, and several other resources and tools that are provided here. And really just some items here as we're moving forward. Clearly, we need to be sharp in what we're doing, and a sharp instrument's going to produce those distinct changes in a reduced amount of time. We need to sharpen our programs, and all of the modules and the tools and the research provided is going to help us to do that. It's a really fantastic repository for educators moving forward, so that we're not using our dull instruments and hacking away and trying to mitigate the unfinished learning that our students have anticipated. And then finally, this is just a great quote, just, something for everyone to really just focus in on, that your system is perfectly designed to produce the results you're already getting. And, if the results that you're getting are not necessarily in line with your district visions and goals and some of the data that you're receiving, then systematic changes need to take place. And again, just thank you for everyone who's participated within the high quality academics area, and we appreciate your time and for professionalism and really just your expertise in providing these great resources for our educators. And with that, I'll stop sharing and take any questions if there are any within high quality academics.
I don't see any hands, and there's no questions in the chat. So thank you, Brian and Brian. Fine job. So we've talked about the social and emotional piece. We've talked about the academic piece. Now, how do we support that? And with us this morning is Erica Caruter, who will talk about developing scaffolded support systems for teachers and students. Erica.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody is doing well and having an enjoyable summer thus far. It's hard to believe it's almost July 1st already. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. If you are following along in the toolkit, you'll find scaffolded supports on page 52. And we really had a large team working on this. As I go through this really is a lot of the work that the IU TAC provide. And so we had a number of IU TAC along with patent consultants. We had a large team of about 30 working on these different modules throughout scaffolded supports. So when we think about scaffolded supports, we're really thinking about intensification of instructional practices and supports to meet the needs of all learners, including students with disabilities. So as we go through this, we're really thinking about how can scaffolded supports be incorporated into policies, procedures, and practices for the school entities that you're supporting. So there are 7 different modules within scaffolded supports. And this is kind of set up again when you think about your TAC team, MTSS TAC, behavior TAC, inclusive practices, your TAC that support the autism initiative, for example. Really anyone from your TAC team may get in and engage and use these modules as they support schools with professional development, with training and consultation. So the 7 different modules: accelerating learning through universal supports. You can think of this as universal design for learning. Addressing the core landscape through explicit instruction. Again, that really is an explicit instructional practices, intensifying that good high quality core instruction. There's a module on implementing class-wide interventions and supports. Systematically addressing strategic and intensive supports. So we can think about those as maybe tier 2 and tier 3. How do we access or provide access to additional accelerated learning experiences? So things like acceleration academies or high dosage tutoring. Ensuring that considerations are in place for supporting students with the most significant learning and behavioral needs. So thinking about our students who may be in an autistic support classroom, who may be receiving life skills support, emotional support, how might we consider accelerating learning for those students with the most significant needs? And then finally, how do we meet the needs of gifted learners? So your point of contact or your liaison for gifted supports would be another member of your IU team to engage here. So as you follow through each of those different areas, there are some key actions to consider when supporting LEAs with the different modules. So thinking about through foundational supports or universal design for learning, there's kind of a checklist of key actions that your TAC can provide as they're working with LEAs. Same with accelerating learning through universal or core landscape. Again, this is explicit instruction. So some key actions to take. Class-wide supports. This is one that often is underutilized in education. I just want to take a minute to highlight this. This is something that the IU TAC, the patent consultants, have been working with schools prior to the pandemic, but essentially when there is a class of students at the classroom level, and that median student, or more than 50% of students in a classroom, are having difficulty with the skill or missing a prerequisite skill, providing short class-wide intervention targeted to that skill can really be an efficient, effective, and equitable way to provide supports to the entire class. When we think about strategic and intensive supports, again, these are key considerations. We often think of these as maybe tier 2 or tier 3, where we're working with a category of need or problem. So for example, maybe we have a small group of students that is having difficulty with computational fluency for sums to 20. And so we're selecting interventions designed to improve that skill. When we think about additional accelerating opportunities, how might we provide those supports? Again, using our data for what additional scaffolded supports might be needed in key content areas. Two big ones are high dosage tutoring and acceleration academies. What are key considerations for supporting students with significant learning and behavioral needs? Can follow the different steps here. How might we consider that? And then supporting gifted students. So then for each of these areas, there are just some general tools, and these are all hyperlinked right in the toolkit, that these could be pulled to help support professional learning, to help support schools. And then you can also find by each of the different 7 modules, resources to help with the implementation when schools want to dig a little bit deeper into one of these areas based upon their data. So you can go through, there's a ton of resources here, explicit instruction, class-wide supports, a class, if an LEA wants to, or their data are reflecting a need for some class-wide intervention for math, for example. There are free open access evidence-based protocols on how to implement that. So that can be provided and linked and used to support districts. Strategic and intensive supports, different resources for that. Scaffolded supports, those additional accelerating opportunities. Considerations for supporting students with significant learning and behavioral needs. And I just want to highlight, there's really a nice repository of briefs here when we have students who not only have significant learning or behavioral needs, but also are English learners. What are some best practices and strategies to help accelerate learning for those students? You can find resources in here. And then finally, supporting gifted students. So all of those resources are built in the toolkit. The professional learning modules, I'll take you out quickly to the website. You can find the recordings. I'll show you briefly here. As TAC work with LEAs on identifying areas of priority, this planning template executive summary, if you click on that, you'll get access to this document, and this might be helpful as they work with LEAs on those different areas. So they can look at the different data, whether it be social, emotional, behavioral data, whether it be the academic data that Dana, that Brian and Brian spoke of. How are our data looking? What are those strengths and challenges? And then what are those priorities based upon data that the LEA really wants to make improvements for with scaffolded supports? And so those setting goals across trimesters, what are those strategies that we're going to implement? Maybe it's class-wide supports for reading, maybe it's class-wide supports for mathematics. What are those targets we'd like to look at? What are the strategies that we'll use? What is our action plan to get there? You know, what materials do we need? Who's responsible? What are those anticipated outputs or milestones? How are we going to monitor our progress? So that is a helpful way to look at that. And then as you get into, as Jeff showed you how to navigate the system, you can scroll down. So if you want to look at class-wide supports, you can find all of the recorded webinars. So that might be something that UTAC pull, and then the PDFs of the presentations are there. So maybe they want to provide some professional development or consultation around class-wide supports. The materials are there, and that's how they would be able to utilize those. But it's just important to consider really that learning environment sets the stage for, you know, for all of this work. So whether it be in core instruction, whether it be in small group or even individualized, having students and staff feel safe, positive, and supported in the school environment is really going to set the stage for all of these, and intensification of our instructional practices and the supports that we provide to students. So that's kind of a brief overview of how you might utilize those resources and engage the IUTAC in work. So I'll stop share and see if there are any questions before I turn it over. Not seeing anything.
Thank you, Erica. So Brian Gasper just showed a slide a minute ago that said that your system is perfectly designed to get the results that you're currently getting. If we want things to be different, then we need to look at different systems within our schools and within our organizations to try to do things a little bit differently. So to talk about the systems conditions and some of those background logistical pieces, we have with us this morning Megan Steiner, who has been leading that charge for us on the Accelerated Learning Project. Good morning, Megan.
Good morning. Thanks to everyone who's been presenting so far. I will share my screen in a moment here. So as Jeff mentioned, I'll be talking about establishing healthy system conditions. My name is Megan Steiner. I work for IU13 as the state lead for K-12 human capital strategies. And that human capital piece around staffing, recruiting, hiring, retaining, that is a piece of establishing healthy system conditions. And the various systems and processes that we talk about in the toolkit are all quite connected to one another and to other domains and components of accelerated learning that my colleagues have been mentioning. Now, if you're following along on the toolkit, we're on page 32. I know for me, I like to be able to follow along and make notes on things I want to check out later, or follow certain links to resources to bookmark for later. So if that's something you're doing, you can follow along starting on page 32. So although these processes are all quite interconnected, they all overlap, we've divided this section of the toolkit into the systems of stakeholder engagement, technology, staffing, scheduling, and of course, managing and improving, figuring out how things are going and what might need to change with any of the aforementioned areas. So we'll start with stakeholder engagement. And to me, it's helpful to look at these key questions mentioned at the top of each subsection, because it helps to think about, okay, what sorts of problems, questions, concerns might a school or LEA leader raise that might indicate that they could find some help through this section of the toolkit. So the key question here is, how will the needs of students and families, especially the most vulnerable, and the voices of educators be incorporated into the structures and decisions that school systems make for the 2021 to 22 school year? Now, though, that's the overarching question, but as we go through and look at some of the suggested key actions in this section, and particularly at the suggested tools and resources, we'll see that these can help address concerns that folks might raise, such as, we didn't have great communication with or buy-in from our school community over the past year. What can we do differently? Or we want to more meaningfully involve teachers and our other staff to inform our plans for next year. Or if that's something you're already planning to do, what are examples of tools we can use to gather stakeholder input in a meaningful way? And of course, this connects to the domains that others have been discussing, because effective stakeholder engagement can enhance plans in any of the domains of accelerated learning, from academics and instruction to performance management. Now, I mentioned I like to take notes on these sorts of documents on things that I may find particularly useful. And I've indicated here just a couple of examples of the sorts of ready to use, or if you prefer, ready to adapt tools that leaders of schools or LEAs might use to gain insight into and to have a two-way communication with their stakeholders. So for example, here's a very thoughtfully developed and vetted set of survey items from Panorama Education that can help with getting that sort of insight into staff and other stakeholders' views on working conditions, policies, changes, school leadership, and so forth. And while oftentimes our minds do go straight to surveys when we think about gathering insight, gathering input, another example is this community conversation planning guide, also noted here, for tools if one wants to use focus groups and those sorts of conversations to get quantitative and qualitative information. I also want to point out a few resources under this section here to collect and analyze data to determine student, educator, and family engagement. So once folks have already determined they're going to use a survey, a focus group, what have you, this can help with those next steps of collecting and looking at the data. We also have pre-recorded webinar modules in this section. These first two, parts 1 and 2, can help address concerns such as, what does authentic stakeholder engagement mean and what does it look like? Or how can we effectively and efficiently organize this stakeholder engagement so that it supports our plans for accelerated learning? Some key takeaways and resources from this module include an introduction to a toolkit specific to school responses to the pandemic that includes stakeholder engagement. Another module is on stakeholder mapping and engaging stakeholders strategically. So this can help with questions around how to effectively engage with internal and external stakeholders surrounding the integration of social emotional learning or other specific school or district-wide initiatives to support all learners. And from this module, you'll get some guidance on how to determine who to engage and how this is related to whichever specific initiative you are focused on, as well as a tool to walk a team through resource mapping to better inform your identified stakeholders about the status and current gaps and so forth in resources. There's also a module on developing district-wide procedures for online and hybrid learning programs. So this can help address questions like, all right, what worked and didn't work in virtual and hybrid instruction over the past year plus, and why did it work or not work? And of course, how can we apply these lessons to developing effective, sustained virtual or hybrid learning models? Because plans for quality hybrid or virtual programs involve other domains like social emotional wellness, strategic staffing, and academics and instruction that address learning loss and inequities. And key takeaways from this module include specific standards and tools for use in planning or adapting hybrid and virtual programs, and practices to support social emotional wellness and school connectedness and to address learning loss. Now, the next section is on technology with the key question of how will each student access learning every day, whether in person or remotely? And this section, the suggested key actions, the tools, can all help with, looking at the topic of technology and education, technology platforms, things we've been putting even more focus on over the past year plus, and thinking, what have we learned? What do we want to continue to adjust? How can we apply the lessons learned? So these can help address questions like, how can we build on strengths and developments in our use of technology during the pandemic? And how can we strategically leverage technology tools, regardless of the learning environment or environments we're planning to use next year? Next, we have a section on staffing related to human capital. As I mentioned, everything from attracting and hiring candidates to retaining them. And we have a somewhat long key question here. How can decisions about retention, assignment, recruitment, and professional learning do each of the following? Consider what student and educator data we have available and what we should begin to collect and analyze. Disaggregate data to consider equity in student learning and base decisions and data about student learning needs. This section is kind of long, as you may anticipate, based on the length of that key overarching question. And you'll see key actions and tools divided into different aspects of that pipeline of staffing, as I referred to earlier. But the tools and the suggested action steps can help address some questions you may have already heard, maybe dealing with in your own organization, such as, we're concerned about staff retention this year, especially after staff may be burned out right now, retention going into next year, and also just retention in the future in general. Or we want to spend time and resources on professional learning as effectively and efficiently as we can. Or how can we make our staffing decisions in ways that promote accelerated learning and student and staff social emotional wellness? So these tools can help address some of those questions. And I wanted to also highlight this section of tools here. Learn about educator needs, perspectives, and future plans. This refers to a few suggested tools here that are useful not only for just getting a count of how many people do we think we will have at the beginning of the school year versus how many we need, although that's important, but also getting more insight into what do staff think about school climate, about leadership, what do they need to feel like they are more effective in their role and to want to stay in their role. Now, modules, webinar modules for this section, as I mentioned, it's a kind of long section, include one on how to assess educators' capacity and needs for effective teaching of accelerated learning. So what that means is, how do we know if our educators are well equipped to support the state priorities for accelerated learning going into next school year? And how can we measure the staff's abilities to support accelerated learning and develop these abilities? So the 6 goals for supporting accelerated learning encompass academics, instruction, stakeholder engagement, staffing, assessment, and performance management, meaning that this module overlaps with a variety of other components of accelerated learning. And through this module, participants can learn about approaches to determining how well a school or system is meeting the priority goals PDE has set for accelerated learning, and some self-assessment questions about your current educators and their capacity to help meet these priority goals. There is a module on staff wellness and working climate and conditions, and the content of this module overlaps quite a bit with that of the section on overall staff and student social emotional wellness. There is also a module on staffing, recruitment, hiring, and training for extended learning opportunities. So this can help with concerns around, okay, during the summer and the school year, how can we use federal funding for extended learning opportunities that can help accelerate learning and address inequities in learning and student performance? How can we attract, select, and train staff from our schools and community to work in summer programs or in school year tutoring programs? So this module provides some concrete suggestions for how to find candidates for these sorts of roles and tailor recruitment efforts, components of effective in-person and virtual tutoring programs, and guidance on how to track the effectiveness of programs and of staff in these programs. Finally, there is a module on mentoring and induction. So if leaders are thinking about how can our system strategically adjust or refine its supports for our newly hired educators, especially those who are starting out in what is shaping up to be another less than usual school year. How can we effectively and efficiently track the performance of mentoring and induction supports and their impact on educator practice and student experiences? So this module includes some concrete advice for training mentors, as well as metrics to use in evaluating the effectiveness of mentoring and induction. Now, another section that folks have been thinking about even more than usual over the past year is scheduling. How can we use data about health, safety, and student needs to inform scheduling decisions that prioritize staff and student well-being, including social, emotional, and academic well-being? This section, these sorts of suggested key actions and tools can help think through, similar to technology, what have we learned and been doing over the past year plus, and what are the lessons learned about what we want to continue, what we want to change? Questions like what ongoing or new safety and logistical factors should we consider when making assignment and scheduling decisions? Or how can we make scheduling decisions that promote accelerated learning and student well-being? There is a module in this section on lessons learned from scheduling and transitions across learning environments over the past year. So again, we have that important question, what worked and what didn't work in terms of plans for in-person, hybrid, and remote learning, and why did it work or not work? And to hear about these sorts of questions, this module provides some insights from leaders of various schools and school systems across Pennsylvania, including concrete advice on what to do in the coming year, and discussion of how various pre-existing local factors, such as shared staff or block scheduling or transportation considerations, have impacted the effectiveness of different scheduling approaches in different districts. Finally, we would be remiss if we did not talk about managing and improving. So how do we know what's working well and what needs to be adjusted? This is a variation on a question I've brought up about other sections, and certainly applies to and has been mentioned in some of the other components of accelerated learning that my colleagues have been discussing. So in other words, thinking about, what in all these domains, in social emotional learning and academics, in strategic supports, how do we track whether things are doing what we want them to do? And those are the sorts of questions these tools can help address. And in this section, we have a module on, and I will scroll down here a moment, a module on implementation and monitoring routines. So how and why should we set up routines to consistently monitor the progress of all the plans and systems related to accelerated learning? And what do useful routines look like? Or in other words, if you have a leader of a school or a system saying our existing approaches to managing and evaluating the performance of various systems is only based on some measures, it's not thorough enough, we want to do it differently, or especially, a leader who knows the importance of monitoring the implementation of these various processes and adjustments to all these systems. But amidst competing priorities, especially during the pandemic and putting out the quote unquote fires that come up every day, plans to manage and evaluate performance may be overlooked. So the tools suggested in this section and this module can help address these sorts of concerns, because all the aforementioned topics require well-planned, regular collaborative monitoring. And key takeaways from this module include sample routines that schools can use for continuous monitoring, the distinction between a routine and a regular meeting, which can help maintain the focus on monitoring routines despite the barriers and distractions that arise every day. And finally, tools used to collect monitoring and implementation data, including a guide to using a plan template. So hopefully a few or more of the modules, action steps, resources in this section caught your attention. Maybe you marked them to check out later. I encourage you to submit any questions you have about any of those sections. And in the meantime, I will turn it back over to Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. There have been a lot of incredible things that have happened in our schools over the last year and a quarter, and many of them due to the support of those of you at the intermediate units and the work that you're doing to ensure a consistent educational process, or as much as possible, in schools during this pandemic. But as we look at transitioning into the new school year, we want to encourage our school leaders to engage in the accelerated learning project and provide access to them to a great number of resources and really solid professional development that can help in the decision-making process. And the best way we found to do that is to offer Act 45 credit to them. So I'm going to take a brief minute to talk through the process and the requirements for the Act 45 course that's associated with the Accelerated Reading Project, and look at some of the components that you may be asked about as you go through that. So we'll go back to the website and take a look at that. Over here on the right side, there are several links that deal with the Act 45 course. And of course, the first step to participating in the course is to be registered. And we currently have just over 80 educational leaders from across the Commonwealth that are signed up to participate in the Act 45 course. And you can receive either 30 or 60 credit hours of Act 45 for participating in these sessions. In order to receive 30 credit hours, you have to participate in 15 sessions. In order to receive 60 credits, you have to participate in 30 of the sessions. And as I mentioned, there are currently 27 webinar videos on the screen. So you have to receive 60 credits, you have to participate in all of those, plus several of the collaborative check-in sessions. And as I mentioned earlier, there are at least 3 collaborative check-in sessions for each component as we move through the last week of June or July and the first 2 weeks of August. So there's still time. Then there's a registration form that they complete. with the sign-offs. Then as they participate in each of the sessions, the last slide in each session includes an attendance link. So they have to go to the link included on that slide and register their attendance. Now, some of the sessions were provided as live synchronous sessions, and some of them were asynchronous, but they are all available now on the YouTube channel. So the bottom link here on the right-hand side goes to the department's YouTube channel for accelerated learning. And here are all of the videos from each of the sessions that were provided through the accelerated learning program. And as I mentioned, there are 27 of them there. There are not videos for the collaborative learning sessions because those are more conversations between the school leaders and accelerated learning support staff to work through that, through questions that they may have. Then after completing and working through each of those sessions, participants have to complete the planning template, the full version. Erica showed you earlier the executive summary, which is a great tool. And then there's the full version of the planning template. And participants, as you all know, to receive Act 45 credit, you have to do face-to-face work, and you have to do independent work, and then you have to complete some sort of project. And that's what the planning template is. It's a tool to help guide their thinking, school leaders' thinking, as they are working through decisions regarding accelerating learning and reopening their schools. So those planning templates have to be completed and turned in to me, submitted to me by October 30th. So get through the summer, get through the opening of school, then that template has to be submitted to me. Now, in several LEAs, we have multiple school leaders, whether they are building leaders or district leaders, that are participating. And as we've said several times, we want accelerated learning to be a systemic plan. So while each individual educational leader has to submit their own template, their own plan for implementing accelerated learning in their area, our hope and our goal would be that if there are multiple plans from the same LEA or same organization, that those plans are pretty well integrated and similar as they work through that process. So all of these resources are available to you and available to LEAs on the Accelerated Learning website. And again, it's education.pa.gov/accelerated learning to make it easy for you to access. 2021 was by far the longest school year that any of us have dealt with in our careers. And as we look at the calendar, it's hard to believe that tomorrow is July 1st. Just kind of blows my mind. Our goal in developing accelerated learning has been to create a simple, flexible plan that can assist LEAs as they are making decisions and making plans for returning to schools. But there are still many things that are up in the air, even as life starts to go back to a little closer to normal. For instance, 2 days ago, the governor lifted the face mandate. But what does that mean to schools and to how school leaders make decisions regarding the CDC guidance and what their local norms are and local expectations are? So there's still a lot of questions that are out there. And as I said, as we've said several times, we wanted to create a toolkit that could assist school leaders in making those decisions. So that's the overview of accelerated learning. And as you heard from Dr. Smith at the beginning of the presentation, our challenge to you and our ask of you is that you continue the amazing work that you're doing supporting LEAs, supporting school and district leaders as they are implementing plans and preparing for the 21-22 school year. We know that there will be many questions that come up as you begin the process of working with LEAs to implement the accelerated learning, and as you dig more into the resources and the tools that are available to you. We do appreciate you taking time to sit with us this morning to review this plan, and we'll pause now to see if there are any questions regarding how regarding anything that you've heard this morning. Any questions at all? Well, hearing none, I'll turn back to the panel to see if there are any final comments from you. Oh, there's a question in the chat. Do we know when the new statement of work will come out? I believe it's in final routing process. One of the final steps in that process was budget approval, and the expectation is that the governor is going to sign the budget documents today. And so my anticipation is that statement of work will be out shortly so that you can see what those expectations are. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for joining us.
There was another question that popped in.
Sorry about that. Thank you for catching that. Do the districts know that they need to submit an accelerated learning plan? Okay, so let's talk about that accelerated learning plan. That's a good question. The accelerated learning plan that LEAs have to submit is their ARP-ESSER application in the eGrants program. So as an LEA goes in to apply for ARP-ESSER, that is their template, or that is their plan document that they have to submit. The document that we looked at on the website, the planning template, both summary and full version, are related to the Act 48 plan, or Act 45 plan, and those requirements. All LEAs are required to submit a plan for accelerated learning if they are going to receive ARP-ESSER funding. And as I said, that application process is, or that plan is their application in eGrants. Do we have to submit, do IUs have to submit an accelerated learning plan? I believe, and don't hold me to this, I believe that there is funding through ARP-ESSER, through the state share for IUs that you will also apply through eGrants. Brian, I saw you started to unmute. If you have information that you can share on that, that would be helpful.
No, I think you're right, because it's part of the state consolidated application. If you are in a position where you're getting ESSER funds, you've got classrooms and you run classrooms or programs or things like that, it's part of the application. So it will come along with filing your ESSER application. So if I guess the question isn't, or the answer isn't a blanket yes, but any IUs that are working through an ESSER application would then by default submit the plan because it's a component of the application.
Yeah, so any entity that is looking to receive this latest round of ESSER funding will submit a plan, and that plan is through eGrants. Does this follow a July 30 deadline? So in order to receive the ARP-ESSER funding, there is a requirement that an organization submit an updated health and safety plan. And some information came out from the department about that, I believe a week or two ago. And that health and safety plan is a modification, a simplification of the health and safety plan that everyone submitted last year. That also is submitted through e-grants as part of the ARP-ESSER funding. There is a July 30th deadline for that component for the health and safety plan. But there actually is no real hard deadline for ARP-ESSER funding because the federal government did not put an application deadline on that. I see a question, a hand raised from Christopher. Chris, go ahead.
Jeff, I think the confusion maybe, and maybe clarify, is with House Bill 1533 that was put out, there was mention of school districts submitting an accelerated learning plan to identify how they're utilizing their funds, which I think was confused with PDE's accelerated learning plan and the work that everyone has done here. So I think maybe that's where some of the confusion is, and maybe it may be helpful, if someone could put a statement out, maybe identifying this is related to this, and here are your deadlines, and this is related to this, and here are your deadlines. Or even if you get that through to us at the IUs, we can communicate that information out to our school districts.
That's a good call. I think, as we were working to associate everything with accelerated learning and having conversations with legislators, then they started using that language, and there probably was some confusion that came into that. Brian, did you have a follow-up comment on that?
No, I think that's perfectly accurate. We had already started down the road of that terminology, and no unnecessary ask or discussed if that was the proper terminology. So yeah, the terminology overlaps, but and that is what, and we are working on that. Will be part of the guidance, especially when we get the state application out. And it was brought up yesterday, and I wasn't probably aware that not all IU folks that work in the realms where they're going to get questions about this had seen it. So I am pushing the state application out through a copy of it, a PDF copy out through Sue Voigt. So you should get that shortly. And you'll see that might help clarify it some for you too. But you are right. There is a section of the application that is your accelerated learning plan that has directly to do with how you spend your funds. And then this also has the term accelerated learning, but that's a planning template that's part of that, either the Act 45 course or, working through the 4 kind of interlocking rings with your own administrative team or something. And we can definitely work to make that clear through PAI, UCC, and through the updates we do. I think the directions for the consolidated application will help, and hopefully you guys getting your hands on the application, that'll probably help some too. So hopefully those steps are a start, Chris, and then if that's not enough, obviously anyone reach out to us and we'll navigate from there.
Very good, thank you. Any other questions? Well, again, thank you for participating. Thank you for the work that you've done to support accelerated learning and this project as we've gone through the development and rollout phase. Thank you for the work that you have been doing and will be doing to support LEAs as they work to support students and staff in their buildings. We do appreciate your time today and wish you well as you continue this process. As we've mentioned, if you do have additional questions as they come out, don't hesitate to reach out to anyone on our team and we will get an answer back to you. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day and your summer. Have a great day, everyone.